Welcome to episode 71 of Anchored in Education. I'm E. Scott England, and Anchored in Education is the podcast dedicated to all things education. Educators across the world routinely engage in conversations surrounding fundamentals, concepts, and new ideas that improve this great profession. Sometimes we agree, other times we disagree. But at the end of the day, we are all anchored in education. Anytime I have the opportunity to have an elected official on the podcast, I'm going to jump at it. I tried to put together a governor series, but so far, every governor's office I have contacted has either ignored the request or officially declined. But some states elect their state superintendents. Back in the early part of this year, we had a discussion with Dr. Jennifer McCormick from Indiana. Today, we are fortunate enough to talk with Joy Hofmeister, the State Superintendent of Public Instruction for the state of Oklahoma. Joy has been the state superintendent since 2015, and she is currently in her second term. She and her team have worked extensively to re-envision state standards, accountability, and assessment, and even the teacher shortage. Joy, welcome to Anchored in Education.
Thank you, Scott. It's good to be with you.
Well, we sure appreciate you taking the time. We know that you have a very busy schedule, but I always find it is important to just see what other states are doing, especially at that state level. And we're going to get into what Oklahoma has been doing since you have taken office in 2015. But before we do that, and before we get started for today's episode, we'd like to find out a little bit more about you and how you became anchored in education.
Well, thank you for the question. And, I played school as a little girl in the basement of my home in Missouri when I was growing up in St. Louis and always wanted to be a teacher. But it was after kind of meandering through college, not sure what I wanted to do, that I came back to that and went back to school after dropping out, getting married, and went back to school determined to be a teacher.
Okay.
And so I came through a little bit of a non-traditional pathway. Then I began teaching and later moved back to my home state where I of Oklahoma, and also raised a family. And during that time, I began working with Kumon, which is an international company that operates in 49 countries.
Okay.
And I became familiar with mastery learning in mathematics and in reading, English language arts. And really, that influenced me tremendously. And during that time, I spent 15 years working with individual student pathways and individualized learning with parent partnerships. And it was work like piano lessons where, yes, you have music at school, but some families choose to go outside of school, have independent lessons. And just like piano, you visit a teacher 1 or 2 times a week. And that's how Kumon works.
Okay.
But the real work is at home. So for me, my philosophy of how do we succeed in school, it depends on building strong family ties and including families engaged in the process.
Yes.
And so I took that to the state level by an accidental happenstance where I asked someone who happened to be working with our governor at the time and just said, hey, let me know if there's ever anything I can do. And lo and behold, that one question the next day turned into, hey, we actually need someone from this area of the state to serve on the State Board of Education. I had never been a part of politics. I had never given a contribution. I'd never served. I couldn't even tell you some of the people that represented me. And I'm embarrassed to say that, but it was how this got started.
Sure.
And so I served on the State Board of Education for about 1.5 years. I realized that there was some need for change, and I ran my first political campaign and won all 77 counties in Oklahoma.
Wow.
so
And
so then I've been on the state, working in my office. I've been elected twice now, and I will finish an 8-year term, 2 4-year terms, and
okay.
I'm term limited
Oh, you
in a
got term
couple of
limits in
years.
Oklahoma.
Yeah,
Okay.
we do.
All right.
So this has been something where I brought both my heart of being a teacher. I've raised 4 kids, my own family there, and then worked with 4,000 students over 15 years and their families, and they come from lots of different backgrounds. So that has really shaped my view
Sure.
of having world class academic standards and high expectations, but knowing teachers can't shoulder it all. It has to be a family and a collaboration of whole child, whole school, whole community, and that's how we're going to move forward.
Absolutely. All right. So you're in your second term. That just began in 2019. We discussed that. But
Mhm.
being an elected official, how does education look being on the other side of the classroom?
Well, I think that it's real easy to forget perspective and your own experience, and times change and things circumstances change, so how it affects you is going to be determined on how quickly you realize that you lose touch as soon as you are in an institution or working in a state level. So we have to do things to keep and maintain that equilibrium in order to make good policy or state decisions going forward. And one of the ways we've done that is to have, from the very onset, community representation as teachers on advisory councils, students, faith based leaders. We have an equity task force. Those, of course, different leaders in districts, those are all represented in different working groups and advisory councils that I lean on a regular basis, month after month.
And I heard you mention students. You include student voice
Yeah.
in many of your decisions.
Absolutely. In fact, our Student Advisory Council is really, really influential in helping us get a glimpse of where we need to go, bringing to the surface those issues that might not occur immediately to adults that are working at the state level. And it also helps us, really, with the heft we need
Uh
to
huh.
get the work completed. An example would be, our Student Advisory Council said, we don't see any benefit in end of year courses. No one looks at that after we graduate. We want ACT or SAT instead. Why can't we? And after ESSA, we did.
Okay.
And we repealed all those 7 end of instruction courses that cost millions and millions and millions of dollars, and replaced them with something of value to students. And it meant scholarship opportunities as well, and the state pays for it. And that is one example of how a student voice went from concept to completion, within basically a year or two period.
Wow. Well, and ultimately, I mean, isn't that why we're here for students?
Yeah, that's
So,
exactly right.
hey, Joy.
Their voice matters tremendously.
Oh my goodness, yeah. So, Joy, let's shift for a minute and talk academic standards. So,
Mhm.
you led the charge to repeal the Common Core standards and implement the Oklahoma academic standards in 2016. There has been bipartisan praise for the standards as well as support from practicing educators. So, do you think you can talk about the parties involved in writing these standards as well as the primary goals for the standards?
Yeah, well, I appreciate that, and it's great to have that kind um, of recognition for what's happened, and it can't just be a perception. It has to be based in evidence. So here's what we did: we brought in a lot of those practitioners in the field, and we combined them with those in higher ed, and we also looked at what will it take for Oklahoma to be a top leading state academically. And we looked at those marks, benchmarks that we're going to be measured by as a state, regardless of what we do with our academic standards. So that was NAEP, the National
Uh huh.
Assessment for Educational Progress, as well as ACT. and we were an ACT state, and still use it.
Okay.
So we then wrote our academic standards for high rigor, but we knew we would need to also look at where we are today, and not just look at academic standards, but how we measure success. And so it's been a process that included first academic standards, then assessment and what we call success, and then how we also build accountability systems. So it all starts, though, with about 3,000 educators who
Wow.
were a part of that process. We took town halls all over the state, and we did that at the beginning and at the end. And we had 3,000 signatures of those who had participated at some level in the writing or the reviewing of that process. So we did that and could say we have Oklahoma standards written by Oklahomans, but we also made them nationally competitive.
Yes.
And that's been bore out by what the research says. And evidence is Oklahoma was ranked 47th lowest in academic standards with a D rating. And then that was in actually 2015 when I took office.
Okay.
And in 2017, that was reevaluated, and we catapulted to an A rating at 17th highest in the country.
Wow, you jumped 30 spots in 2 years.
Yeah. Yeah.
Wow.
And we were A rated, which is what we wanted.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Well, let's talk about, in education, we went from No Child Left Behind to Every Student Succeeds Act. We've had this conversation on Anchored in Education before, but never from the viewpoint of an elected state official. So I'm going to ask you, how frustrating is it to get things accomplished on your state level when the federal government continues to impose federal guidelines, especially, since the 10th Amendment gives us the power to make decisions about education, it gives it to the states. It's supposed to anyway.
Mm-hmm. Yes, it's very important. And actually, I was so honored to be asked to speak to Congress on this very issue at a time where ESSA had only been about 2 months old.
Okay.
And I was a part of a group that met with President Obama at the time and urged him to sign this repeal of No Child Left Behind with new law, with Every Student Succeeds Act.
Sure.
And so what I said in my testimony was, states know their students best, and we need the flexibility to be able to meet the needs that fit our local context, but hold us accountable. We do believe in the robust accountability systems, but we have to be able to drive that,
Yes.
and it needs to fit our local state and and better fit our local context. And so we did do that, and it was very frustrating prior to ESSA. And ESSA also really kind of harnessed or tempered the Secretary of Education's ability to just put out dear colleague letters and write a lot of guidance that would be adopted uniformly, it seemed. And so that changed with ESSA. And as a state leader, I appreciate that, because again, that gets political, and we really want to minimize politics when it comes to education and focus on our kids and their right for a competitive education that prepares them for life.
Sure. And so, going with what you kind of just said, we need to keep politics at a minimum in education. So there's a teacher shortage nationwide, and I'm sure that Oklahoma is not exempt of this, that you're facing the same thing. So I have a personal opinion. I stand by it. I've said it for years, and it's that legislative overreach is one of the top factors of attrition and lower recruitment. But I know that there are other factors too. Have you seen a reduction in autonomy offered to teachers? And do you believe giving more local control could result in filling vacancies and boosting our schools?
I have seen legislative overreach, both at the federal level and at the state level. In fact, I would call it, for teachers, initiative fatigue.
Okay.
And we have seen teachers I would say maybe 6 years ago, that was the close of a period of time nationally where there was a lot of sweeping similarities in how we evaluate teachers and how we provide use test scores for third graders
Right.
and talk about retention. There was a lot of common policies. And so that meant that people would drop legislation in that was designed for maybe Connecticut and place that in a Western state that has a very different funding formula, but expects results without the additional support to get there. And when things would be adopted and passed, teachers were whipsawed back and forth.
That's a
with
good way to put
changes
it.
that would happen. And at some point, you do that enough, and people just break,
Yeah.
or they completely ignore good things and say, we're just going to ignore whatever because I've been here longer than those initiatives or those state lawmakers.
Yep, I've heard that.
And we're just going to close our ears and hunker down and do our own thing. And actually hunkering down sometimes means, we do have new academic standards. Like, we do need to pay attention to some of the things that are happening and not just keep doing what we were doing, because now we're not necessarily teaching our standards anymore. So there is a real need for strong principles. And coming back to your question and discussion about teacher shortages, I think teachers will stay in a school despite a lot of things that happen regarding pay, for example, or not having resources for students, if they have a principal who has their back and who is a champion for children and understands the importance of supporting teachers and having a counselor and using the counselor not as a test coordinator, but as a real support for students that then supports the teachers and the classroom impact. And so when we think about the whole big picture, Oklahoma had to do some things differently, and we did. We addressed pay. You can't stay in a profession you love if you can't pay your bills.
Sure.
And our teachers were leaving, and what we did is right away did a survey, and we had I think it was 8,000 respondents to the 20-some thousand that we had email addresses for that had left the profession or retired. But we asked them, why are you continuing to keep your teaching certificate valid every 5 years, but you're not in an Oklahoma classroom?
Right.
And 8,000 responded, and we knew for a good majority of these people, it was about pay. And for others, they kind of deepened their answer to say it was about lack of discipline in classrooms. It was that initiative fatigue. It was not having a principal that had their back. So strong leaders in school do help with keeping a strong faculty of teachers that are there for kids. And we had to address that, but we needed, most importantly, to move from one of the lowest states in pay. And we did that. And we in Oklahoma, in a very red state, and I'm a Republican, and I led that charge also from day one in office. We have to have competitive pay, and we've got to be at the top of our region. And then the next level is we need to be nationally competitive with at least being at the national average. So we were able to do this. And Oklahoma passed actually a pay raise that included raising taxes. That hadn't been done, the raising taxes, in 28 years.
Wow.
We hadn't had that kind of a change. And so when we got this, it was something that was pretty remarkable. And we were able to give our teachers a $7,400 raise across the board on average for all of our teachers in 2 back-to-back legislative sessions.
Well, that is impressive. And then beyond that, one of the things that, excuse me, that I heard is that that survey allowed you to hear teacher voice. We talked about student voice and what works, but if we're talking about a teacher shortage, it only makes sense that we hear from them and find out what we can do and then address that, because a lot of times we think, well, this is definitely what will be the silver bullet to solve everything. But once we kind of drill down, we find out there's a whole lot more stuff going on that could be relatively easier fixes if we just address that. And it sounds like that's what you did.
Yes, and that data then helps us ask better questions so that we can arrive at a solution that really works.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, so shifting again, we cannot ignore that we have been through some, lack of better words, interesting times during the past 3 months. In fact, you and I were originally scheduled to connect back in early March, but obviously we both got real busy real quick. So let's talk. Right, that's an understatement, isn't it?
Understatement.
What did remote learning look like in Oklahoma, and how well do you believe educators throughout your state responded?
It didn't look the same as every state. And in Oklahoma, we still have a lot of families that don't have access to internet. So remote learning included paper packets and using other resources besides internet connection. But there was internet connection as well, and we had lots of teachers. Of course, I like to brag on Oklahoma teachers with very little notice.
Yes.
They moved heaven and earth to re-engage with their students, and that was incredible. No teacher, though, will tell you that they believe their kids got what they would have received had they been face-to-face with them.
No way.
In a classroom. And we recognize that as well. So now we are in a place with little information that's specific. And we need specificity when we're in a crisis. And when we go back to school, we have a plan called Return to Learn Oklahoma, a framework for reopening schools.
Okay.
And that includes, again, teacher voice, parent voice, student voice, but also health professionals, the CDC, of course. Every state is approaching this, I think, in really remarkable ways. But we recognize that we don't know where our kids are. And we've got to quickly come to that recognition and build an individual path for them to close unfinished learning, close instructional gaps. For others, they can't wait when they're ready to move much faster than others. We owe it to that child too, to be able to climb higher and faster. And if we have that individualized approach, and this kind of goes back to my roots where I talked about at the very beginning, we will unleash a progress and empowering of students and teachers that I think can act as a springboard. But it's going to mean that we have to have different tools. We have to be willing and ready to pivot. Right now is going to be a time for planning and having plan A, B, C, D, E. and we're going to build basically a multi-tiered system of support for our families and schools families to know, all right, if our county is, according to the health department, at this code or this color, these are the safety precautions, and this is how we're going to deliver education. And so our districts are providing those initial ideas, and we hope that if we stay in a place where things are controlled with the path of the coronavirus, that we can enter school the same way that we had hoped. But we know we're going to have additional safety precautions. We've got to layer safeguards, and we can't just get by the way we had to in the spring.
Yes.
There's not going to be an excuse for that. We're providing funding, Of course, not enough, but resources dedicated to doing something with where we knew we had weaknesses in the spring. And we can't accept anything less than what our kids deserve, no matter how we have to deliver it to them. They cannot just have, a pause on education. And so I don't know what it will actually look like, but we're going to be planning and making those important plans to pivot to what is needed in real time. And that's going to require some patience
Yes.
and some grace. And I think more creativity than we're used to providing, maybe, and collaboration with our communities that we need now more than ever.
Sure. And I was just talking about this to someone yesterday that what we saw in the spring was more of we just needed to keep our head above water and maintain. But now as we approach fall, it's time to get a boat, and we got to be in it, and we got to be able to move through the waters now. So
that's a great analogy. I'm going to use that.
Yeah, please
I'm
do.
going to borrow that, Scott. That is really good.
But
that is really good.
And the thing is, and you said it, that not all states are the same. I'm here in Illinois, you're in Oklahoma, and it's not going to look the same. But it doesn't mean we can't learn from each other as we go through this. And I think that's one of the greatest things we can do. I know I've read plans from all kinds of states just to get an idea, and my own included. So I guess that leads me in to say, before we go today, Joy, what is a message you could deliver to educators across the world, regardless of their state, that could help promote the message of supporting public education?
I'm going to come back to the whole child and family support, because no matter what the conditions, no matter where we deliver education, remotely, through a computer screen or face-to-face, we've got to do everything we can to recognize that our children can't learn if they're hungry. They can't learn if they're preoccupied with stress or chronic trauma. We know that children who are away from school sometimes are not safe.
Right.
And this is part of why the American Academy of Pediatrics wants to see school open with kids in it, because they will be getting nutrition and that support with peers and psychological support. Their development increases socially. This is about meeting the needs of the whole child, no matter what is in our path. And that has to stay central and a primary focus, knowing that we've got to engage families in this process. And I believe that is the way that we lift academic outcomes and that we see growth, because then we have multiplied the impact, not just during school hours or during a time with a lesson, but now we have a whole system of support around kids. And that's how we're going to do much better than we have in the past, is engaging those families and bridging the divide where there is a disconnect with families. Someone's got to step in and be there. And a lot of times that's been teachers, but more and more of our community can be involved. So it takes all of us to do this. And I still have optimism because of the people who are doing this together.
Absolutely. That is a good message for any time, but especially going back as we are approaching fall 2020 for the 2020-2021 school year. I think that our focus on the whole child, the focus on family, the strengthening our communities, that couldn't have come at a better time. Joy, thank you so much for joining us on Anchored in Education today.
Thank you, Scott.
Now, you can read more about Joy on my website, escottengland.com, and you can find her on Twitter by searching @Joy4OK. Before I wrap up today's episode, don't forget to subscribe to Anchored in Education on whatever platform you get your podcasts. I enjoy talking to elected officials even if they're from different states. It is no secret that I am often at odds with elected officials when it comes to education policy. Even if the elected official is a former educator, I find it hard to believe they approach education with the same lens that they used when they were in the classroom. But here's the thing. If we work towards a singular goal of making education better for our students, then we must learn to work together. Because while I may not agree with everything that is said, I would venture that odds are pretty good they don't agree with me either. But both sides must be willing to listen, just as Joy talked about as the state of Oklahoma went through various restructuring and revisioning of the things that they're doing in education. I'd like to believe after our conversation that Joy listens to those who are currently still in the classroom. She has an advantage over many officials. She knows what it is like. I am extremely grateful she took the time to talk to us today. I think her approach to education should be respected. Her job is not easy, nor is ours. Let's work together to make education a better profession for all involved. Because at the end of the day, we are all anchored in education.